Hello, Rolette 10th graders. Hey, I'm sitting in my room. I'm going to start reading To Kill a Mockingbird. This may or may not be helpful. It's really hard to position a camera so that you get decent lighting, and you got to look at my face anyway. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to start on page 165 and 163 in the paperback. I think it's 165. They have been in the courthouse. They're seeing these people on the lawn, and they're moving into the courthouse and seeing it. It's really, really crowded. Okay. And they just identified a group of guys that old gentlemen that like to sit and watch all the court proceedings. Okay, I'm going to read all the way through chapter 17, so this is going to be a little bit lengthier of a read. Okay, all right. Let's see. When they spoke. Okay, normally I'm going to bottom of kind of the middle paragraph there, talking about these men that sit and watch a lot of the proceedings at court. When they spoke, their voices sounded casually important. The conversation was about my father. Thinks he knows what he's doing, one said. Oh, now I wouldn't say that, said another. Atticus Finch is a deep reader, a mighty deep reader. He reads all the time, that's all he does, the club snickered. Let me tell you something now, Billy, a third said. You know the court appointed him to defend this N? Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it. So they know that he was appointed to do it, but they don't like the fact that he's doing it, even though he didn't really solicit this case. This was news. News that put a different light on things. Atticus had to, whether he wanted to or not. I thought that he hadn't said anything to us about it. We could have used it many times in defending him and ourselves. He had to. That's why he was doing it. Equaled fewer fight. He had to. That's why he was doing it. Equaled fewer fights and less fussing. But did that explain the town's attitude? The court appointed Atticus to defend him. Atticus aimed to defend him. That's what they didn't like about it. It was confusing. The Negroes, having waited for the white people to go upstairs, began to come in. Whoa, now, just a minute, said a club member, holding up his walking stick. Just don't start up them there stairs yet a while. The club began its stiff-jointed climb and ran into Dill and Jem on their way down looking for me. They squeezed past and Jem called, Scout, come on, there ain't a seat left. We'll have to stand up. Looky here now, he said irritably as the black people surged upstairs. The old men ahead of them would take most of the standing room. We were out of luck, and it was my fault, Jim informed me. We stood miserably by the wall. Can you all get in? Reverend Sykes was looking down at us, black hat in hand. Hey, Reverend, said Jim. Nah, Scout here messed up. Well, let's see what we can do. Reverend Sykes edged his way upstairs. In a few moments he was back. There's not a seat downstairs. Do you all reckon it'll be all right if you all come to the balcony with me? Gosh, yes, said Jim. Happily, we sped ahead of Reverend Sykes to the courtroom floor. There we went up a covered staircase and waited at the door. Reverend Sykes came puffing behind us and steered us gently through the black people in the balcony. 4 Negroes rose and gave us their front row seats. The colored balcony ran along three walls of the courtroom like a second-story veranda, and from that we could see everything. So the blacks are all upstairs, okay? The jury sat to the left under long windows. Sunburned, lanky, they seemed to be all farmers, but this was natural. Townsfolk rarely sat on juries. They were either struck or excused. One or two of the jury looked vaguely like dressed-up Cunninghams. At this stage, they sat straight and alert. The circuit solicitor and another man, Atticus, and Tom Robinson, sat at tables with their backs to us. There was a brown book and some yellow tablets on the solicitor's table. Atticus's was bare. Just inside the railing that divided the spectators from the court, the witnesses sat on cowhide bottom chairs. Their backs were to us. Judge Taylor was on the bench, looking like a sleepy old shark. His pilot fish riding rapidly below in front of him. Riding rapidly below in front of him. I think pilot is a type of a pen. It's a type of a pen, yeah. Judge Taylor looked like most judges I'd ever seen. Amiable, white-haired, slightly ruddy-faced, he was a man who ran his court with an alarming informality. He sometimes propped his feet up. He often cleaned his fingernails with his pocket knife. In long equity hearings, especially after dinner, he gave the impression of dozing, an impression dispelled forever when a lawyer once deliberately pushed a pile of books to the floor in a desperate attempt to wake him up. Without opening his eyes, Judge Taylor murmured, Mr. Whitley, do that again and it'll cost you $100. So the judge looks like he's sleeping. He's not asleep. Okay. He was a man learned in the law, and although he seemed to take his job casually, in reality, he kept a firm grip on any proceedings that came before him. Only once was Judge Taylor ever seen at a dead standstill in open court, and the Cunninghams stopped him. Old Sarum, their stamping grounds, was populated by two families, separate and apart from the beginning, but unfortunately bearing the same name. The Cunninghams married the Coninghams until the spelling of the names was academic. Academic until a Cunningham disputed a Coningham over land titles and took to the law. Okay, so there's a fight that's going on between these two families. Okay, this is previously. Okay, pardon me, I'm still struggling with my cold. And took to the law. During a controversy of this character, James Cunningham testified that his mother spelled it Cunningham on deeds and things, but she was really a Coningham with a C-U, and she spelled it, but she's really a C-O. She was an uncertain speller, a seldom reader, and was given to looking far away sometimes when she sat in the front gallery in the evening. After 9 hours of listening to the eccentricity of old Sarum's inhabitants, Judge Taylor threw the case out of court. When asked upon what grounds, Judge Taylor said, Champertus connivance. I don't even know what that means, people. Champertus connivance, and declared he hoped to God the litigants were satisfied by each other having had their public say. They were. That was all they wanted in the first place. So they didn't really get any result, but they got a chance to take their frustrations out in public. Judge Taylor had one interesting habit. He permitted smoking in his courtroom, but did not himself indulge. Sometimes, if one was lucky, one had the privilege of watching him put a long, dry cigar into his mouth and munch it slowly up. Bit by bit, the dead cigar would disappear, to reappear some hours later as a fat, flat, slick mess. Its essence is extracted and mingled with Judge Taylor's digestive juices. Oh my gosh, he chews cigars like chewing tobacco. I once asked Atticus how Mrs. Taylor stood to kiss him, but Atticus said, they didn't kiss much. That's great. The witness stand was to the right of Judge Taylor, and when we got to our seats, Mr. Heck Tate was already in it. So there's a witness. He's going to be Heck Tate. That's the sheriff. He's going to be the first witness. Chapter 17. Jim, I said, are those the Ewells sitting down yonder? Hush, said Jim. Mr. Heck Tate's testifying. Mr. Tate had dressed for the occasion. He wore an ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his high boots, lumberjacket, and bullet-studded belt. From that moment, he ceased to terrify me. He was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. The solicitor, a Mr. Gilner, was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville. We saw him only when court convened, and that rarely, for court was of no special interest to Jem and me. A balding, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Although his back was to us, we knew he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person when he was actually doing nothing of the kind. Thus he was hell on juries and witnesses. The jury, thinking themselves under close scrutiny, paid attention. So did the witnesses, thinking otherwise. In your own words, Mr. Tate, Mr. Gilmer was saying. Well, said Mr. Tate, touching his glasses and speaking to his knees, I was called. Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you. Who called you? Mr. Tate said, I was fetched by Mr. Bob Ewell yonder, one night. What night, sir? Mr. Tate said, it was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Ewell came in. Very excited he was, and said to get out to his house quick. Some end had raped his girl. Did you go? Certainly. Got in the car and went out just as fast as I could. And what did you find? Found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner, and said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson. Judge Taylor, who had been concentrating on his fingernails, looked up as if he were expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there was to it. Thank you, Mr. Gilmer, said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, Any questions, Atticus? Yes, said my father. He was sitting behind the table. His chair was skewed to one side. His legs were crossed, and one arm was resting on the back of his chair. Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor? Asked Atticus. No, sir, said Mr. Tate. Didn't call a doctor? No, sir, repeated Mr. Tate. Why not? There was an edge to Atticus's voice. Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened. It was obvious. But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one? No, sir. Judge Taylor broke in. He's answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. Atticus said, I just wanted to make sure, Judge. And the judge smiled. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was trying to be dramatic. Dill was watching peacefully, and so was Reverend Sykes beside him. What is it? I whispered, and I got a terse shh. Sheriff, Atticus was saying, you say she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, just describe her injuries, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruises coming on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. How do you know? Mr. Tate grinned. Sorry, that's what they said. That's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming. Which eye? Mr. Tate blinked and ran his hands through his hair. Let's see, he said softly. And they looked at Atticus as if he considered the question childish. Can't you remember? Atticus asked. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, Her left. Wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you, or her left was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were? Mr. Tate said, Oh yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. When he turned his head and looked around at Tom Robinson, as if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Atticus walked to the court's reporter desk and bent down to the furiously scribbling hand. It stopped, flipped back to shorthand pad, and the court reporter said, and this is, now see, they have court reporters who write in shorthand, and they can write really fast, okay? Okay. So now he's repeating what she wrote. The court reporter said, or she's repeating what she'd written. Mr. Finch, I remember now she was bunged up on that side of the face. Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. Which side again, Heck? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Atticus seemed to be bordering on another question, but he thought better of it and said, Yes, what were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson as if to say this was something they hadn't bargained for. Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her throat? At the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly. And Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. Below us, heads turned, feet scraped the floor, babies were shifted to shoulders, and a few children scampered out of the courtroom. The negroes behind us whispered softly among themselves. Dill was asking Reverend Sykes, what was it all about? But Reverend Sykes said he didn't know. So far, things were utterly dull. Nobody had thundered, there was no arguments between opposing counsel, there was no drama. A grave disappointment to all present, it seemed. Atticus was proceeding amiably as if he were involved in a title dispute. With his infinite capacity for calming turbulent seas, he could make a rape case as dry as as dry as a sermon. Sermons are dry, huh? He could make a rape case as dry as a sermon. Gone was the terror in my mind of stale whiskey and barnyard smells, of sleepy-eyed, sullen men, of a husky voice calling in the night, "Mr. Finch, they gone?" Our nightmare had gone with daylight. Everything would come out all right. So she says, "This isn't all that exciting." All the spectators were as relaxed as Judge Taylor except Jim. His mouth was twisted into a purposeful half grin, and his eyes happy about. And he said something about corroborating evidence, which made me sure he was showing off. Robert E. Lee Ewell. Okay, now he's being called up, I think. In answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin, pointed, and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It seemed to be part of his crepey neck. "So help me God," he crowed. So he's on the stand and he's taking his oath. Every town the size of Macomb had families like the Ewells. No economic fluctuations changed their status. People like the Ewells lived as guests of the county on prosperity as well as in the depths of depression. No truant officers could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health officer could free them from congenital defects, various worms, and the diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. So the Ewells are just really dirty people, okay? They live off the county. It's just bad news, okay? The varmints had a lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough cleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. So they go to the garbage dump literally and pull in garbage, and that's what they eat and they gather, okay? So their house around it just looks just terrible. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs, broomsticks, and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammerheads, snaggletooth rakeheads, shovels, axes, and grubbing toes, held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient ice box, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars, under which scrawny orange chickens pecked hopefully. So their yard is just a mess, okay? One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Macomb. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson. But Miss Maudie deigned to permit a geranium on her premises. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. No one had occasion to pass by except at Christmas, when the churches delivered baskets, and when the mayor of Macomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own trees and trash. Atticus took us with him last Christmas when he complied with the mayor's request. A dirt road ran from the highway past the dump down to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond the Ewells. It was necessary either to back out to the highway or to go the full length of the road and turn around. Most people turned around in the Negroes' front yards. In the frosty December dusk, their cabins looked neat and snug with pale blue smoke rising from the chimneys and doorways glowing amber from the fires within. There were delicious smells about chicken, bacon frying crisp as the twilight air. Jim and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit, aromas that vanished when we rode back past the Ewell residence. Oh, so I think the Ewells eat possum and rabbit. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbors was that if it scrubbed with lye soap under very hot water, his skin was white. So this Ewell cleans up pretty well, okay? Robert E. Lee Ewell, this is a very small guy. Okay. "Mr. Robert Ewell?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "That's my name, Captain," said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I'd heard that lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in court in the heat of argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemies of their parents. They suffer agonies, and they're surprised to see them often go out arm in arm with their tormentors during the first recess. This was not true of Jem and me. We acquired no traumas from watching our father win or lose. I'm sorry that I can't provide any drama in this respect. If I did, it would not be true. We could tell, however, that when debate became more acrimonious than professional, that means people are starting to get kind of testy when they argue. When debate became more acrimonious than testimonial, but this is from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except to a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmer was doing his job as Atticus was doing his. Besides, Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmer's witness, and he had no business being rude to him of all people. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Was the next question. Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead, was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in his swivel chair and looked benignly at the witness. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? He asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. Yes, sir, Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. This is the first time you've ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here. At the witness's affirmation nod, he continued, well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand? Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, all right, Mr. Gilmer. Now, see what he said? Okay, this is interesting. When he asked the question, are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead. Meaning that if he's not the father, her mother knows, but she's dead, so I don't know who the father would be, which the judge considered to be really inappropriate communication. You're either the father or you're not. Don't suggest that your wife might have had an affair and you don't know about it, okay? He didn't like that. Okay. Mr. Ewell, do you understand? Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, all right, Mr. Gilmer. Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you tell us in your own words what happened on the evening of November 21st, please? Jem grinned and pushed his hair back. Just in your own words was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid his witness might employ. In your own words. So the Mr. Gilmer's always saying, in your own words, would you please, in your own words. And the kids are going, well, who else's words are going to talk? It's going to be their own words. Of course it is. Kind of funny. Well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house. Here Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness and must have decided his speculations devoid of evil intent, for he subsided sleepily. What time was it, Mr. Ewell? Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was saying Mayella was screaming fit to be Jesus. Another glance from the bench, silenced Mr. Ewell. Yes, she was screaming, said Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell looked confusedly at the judge. Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and ran as fast as I could, but I run into the fence. But when I got distangled, I run up to the window and I seen... Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. I seen that black end yonder rutting on my Mayella. Ooh, that's pretty vivid language. So serene was Judge Taylor's court, they had a few occasions to use his gavel, but he hammered fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench, saying something to him. Mr. Heck Tate, as first officer of the county, stood in the middle of the aisle, quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us, there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. So this is turned, when he says that, he's saying that he saw what the guy was doing to his daughter. Okay, everybody's upset by this one. Okay. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dylan and me, pulling at Jem's elbow. Mr. Jem, he said, you better take Miss Jean Louise home. Mr. Jem, you hear me? Jem turned his head. Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home. That means Jem does not want to leave. You got to make me first, I said, remembering Atticus's blessed dictum. Jem scowled furiously at me, then said to Reverend Sykes, I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it. I was mortally offended. I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can. Hush, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. So Scout hears this language. She doesn't quite know what they're actually saying is going on, okay? You know, of course, that this is a rape charge and what's being described here. But she didn't understand, and Jim and the pastor's nervous because he doesn't want her to hear this stuff. But Jim said she doesn't understand it anyway, so don't worry about it. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. Reverend Sykes' black eyes were anxious. Mr. Finch, know you're all here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or you boys either. Jim shook his head. He can't see us this far away. It's all right, Reverend. I knew Jim would win because I knew nothing could make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while. Atticus could see us from where he was if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell was sitting smugly in his witness chair, surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps lessening in intensity until the only sound in the courtroom was the dim pink, pink, pink. The judge might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing, and I thought about when Atticus had said he and Mrs. Taylor didn't kiss much. He must have been nearly 70. There has been a request, Judge Taylor said, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, or at least of women and children, a request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Ewell, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that is possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer. So he's kind of said, people, if you make noise, you're not going to leave. You're going to leave, but I'm going to hold you in contempt of court. So he's getting pretty serious here. Mr. Ewell reminded me of a deaf mute. I was sure he'd never heard the words Judge Taylor directed at him. His mouth struggled silently with them, but their importance registered on his face. Smugness faded and replaced by a dogged earnestness that fooled Judge Taylor not at all. As long as Mr. Ewell was on the stand, the judge kept his eyes on him, as if daring him to make a false move. Okay. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again, his fist rested on his cheek, and we could not see his face. Mr. Gilmer looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yes, I did. The spectators were quiet, but the defendant said something. Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. So Tom said something to Atticus, and Atticus whispers back to him. What say you were at the window? Asked Mr. Gilmer. Yes, sir. How far is it from the ground? About 3 foot. Did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. How did the room look? Well, it was all slung about like there was a fight. What did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who he was, all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor squalling. Then what did you do? Well, I run for Tate, quick as I could. I knowed who it was, all right. Lived down yonder in the end nest, past the house every day. Jedge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. This is the guy who's got junk all over, and he says, they're devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. His attorney wants him to shut up because he sounds like a jerk when he talks. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. Just a minute, sir, said Atticus genially. Can I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell backed up into the witness chair, settled himself, and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion, an expression common in Macomb County witnesses when confronted by opposing counsel. Mr. Ewell, Atticus began, folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see, you say you ran to the house, You ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor? Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand, said Atticus. Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition? I most positively was, said Mr. Yule. I seen who done it. No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention? What? Didn't you think that she should have had a doctor immediately? The witness said he never thought of it, that he never called a doctor to any of his in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. That all? He asked. Not quite, said Atticus casually. Mr. Yule, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you? How's that? You were in the courtroom when Mr. Heck Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you? Mr. Yule considered the matter carefully and seemed to decide that the question was safe. Yes, he said. Do you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries? How's that? Atticus looked around at Mr. Gilmer and smiled. Mr. Yule seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. So he's trying not to help Atticus. He doesn't want to give him any information that might help him. Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten around the... Oh, yeah, said the witness. I hold with everything Tate said. You do, said Atticus mildly. I just want to make sure. He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for some minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it were stock market quotations. Which eye, her left? Oh, yes, she'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now she was bunged. He flipped the page. Up to that side of the face, Sheriff, please. Up to that side of the face, Sheriff. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. So she's repeating the transcript of what had happened earlier, okay? It's a little confusing. Thank you, Bert, said Atticus. You heard it again, Mr. Yule. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff? I holds with Tate. Her eye was blacked, and she was mighty beat up. The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus an easy match. He seemed to grow ruddy again. His chest swelled, and once more he was a red little rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. Mr. Yule, can you read and write? Mr. Gilmer interrupted. Objection, he said. Can't see what witness's literacy has to do with the case. Relevant and immaterial. Judge Cheddar was about to speak, but Atticus said, Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see. All right, let's see, said Judge Cheddar, but make sure we see, Atticus. Overruled. Mr. Gilmer seemed as curious as the rest of us as to what bearing the state of Mr. Yule's education had on the case. I'll repeat the question, said Atticus. Can you read and write? I most positively can. Will you write your name and show us? I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks? I mean, the county sends him money and he cashes them. And that's what he lives off. Mr. Yule was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. So people are enjoying him. They think he's kind of a weird guy, but he's kind of fun to laugh at. Okay. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he'd gone frog sticking without a light. Frog sticking. That means you're going outside looking for frogs, but you need a light to gather them. Okay. What an interesting phrase. It seemed he'd gone frog sticking without a light. Never on cross-examination ask a witness a question you don't already know the answer to. Was a tenet I absorbed with my baby food. Do it, and you'll often get an answer you don't want, an answer that might wreck your case. So she's saying, why is my dad doing this? He's asking a question he doesn't know the answer to. If you're a good lawyer, you always ask questions you know what the answer is going to be, so that other people find out what the answers are. Okay. Atticus, and so this, even Scout realizes this, even at her age, okay? Atticus was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an envelope, then reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely and had turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen cap and placed it gently on the table. He shook the pen a little, then handed it with the envelope to the witness. Would you write your name for us? He asked. Clearly now, so the jury can see you do it. Mr. Yule wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see the judge. Taylor staring at him. And to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand. To see Mr. Gilmer half standing at his table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. "What's so interesting?" he asked. "You're left-handed, Mr. Yule," said Judge Taylor. Mr. Yule turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a Christ-fearing man, and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Let's see. Okay. Can you hold on just a second? I got about 1 minute to finish reading. Okay. Let me pause this, you guys. No, wait, I don't want to pause it because sometimes it messes up when I pause. Give me about 1 more minute, okay? Okay. "You're left-handed, Mr. Yule," said Judge Taylor. Mr. Yule turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, but that he was a Christ-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Tricking lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of him all the time with their tricking ways. He had told them what happened. He said he'd say it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story. That he looked through the window, then he ran the N off, then ran for the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. "About your writing with your left hand. Are you ambidextrous, Mr. Yule?" "I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other, one hand good as the other," he added, glaring at the defense table. So ambidextrous means you can use your hand, and he says, "No, I'm not ambidextrous." He doesn't know the meaning of the word. Jem seemed to be having a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony rail softly, and once he whispered, "We've got him." "I don't think so. I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Yule could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was blacked and she was beaten mostly on the right side of her face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Sherlock Holmes and Jem Finch would agree. But Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Tate, I imagined a person facing me, went through a swift mental pantomime, and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked down at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulders and bulk thick neck. He could easily have done it. I thought Jem was counting his chickens," meaning she thinks Jem is too confident that maybe things aren't going as well as Jem thinks they are, but Jem thinks they're going well. Okay, you guys, thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.